This is Lab 4, Oscillations. So this is the table of contents. First is the introduction, and the purpose of this lab is to observe the motion of an oscillating and swinging spring. And we're going to simulate this motion and compare the simulation output to what we observed in both the x and y directions. Throughout this lab, we're going to assume that there's no external forces acting on the spring other than the spring force and then the force of gravity, and that there's no motion in axes other than the x and the y. And some key concepts are Hooke's law, the conservation of energy. The energy before is going to be equal to the energy after because there's no external work done. And then the types of energies that we're being looking at are the gravitational potential energy, spring potential energy, and the kinetic energy. And then the velocity and position update formulas. So for the results, we're going to be looking at a spring that is going to be oscillating in both the x and the y directions, and that the energy is going to be conserved in the system, so the energy before should always equal the energy after. And on to the actual experiment. So we had this black thing represent the mass that was attached to the spring, with the spring force being the F of S and the force of gravity being F of G. And so the system is going to be the spring, the mass attached to the spring, and the earth, because we're looking at the potential energies of the spring and the earth, and the gravitational potential by the earth, so they must all be included in the system. And then the surroundings is just going to be everything else. And so then this is a tracker analysis. The spring was dropped and then it oscillated as such, and I selected the center of mass each time to record the new position, and then I turned the X and the Y columns into a CSV, which then I used in the sample code provided to analyze the data. So this was the simulation code. First was the initial conditions on the left-hand side where I got the mass of the ball, and then I got the spring constant K and the relaxed length of the spring from the pre-lecture video, and then I did all the formulas for the initial energies, and then on the right hand side is the loop for each time step. And in the beginning I set the net force, so I found the force of gravity and the force of the spring, and then I did the velocity and position update formula to update the position. And then at the end, I updated all of the energies, and just notice that the total energy, the change in total energy, should be 0 when the code is run, because energy is meant to be conserved, and the glow script code is going to be in the description. Now onto the data analysis. So this is the simulation on the left-hand side, and then what we output was on the right. The data in the red is going to be the experimental data that we observed, and then the blue is going to be the model. They are a little bit different, but they are relatively similar to each other, so that is something that you should take note of. And then on the left-hand side, we can see like the way that the ball attached to the spring was moving around in an oscillating pattern in both the x and the y direction, and this is the final graph that was output. As you can see, the change in energy is the orange line, and it stayed at deltas at 0, which means that the energy was constant throughout the entire process. Now onto the discussion. So for the analysis and basically conclusion of the experiment, the spring oscillated in both the x and the y direction. Total energy was conserved throughout the entire experiment, which means that no external work was done, and that could be seen on the last graph with the orange line being at 0, so that there was 0 change in energy throughout the experiment. And then the simulation also could relatively predict the motion of the spring accurately, as like the two lines were relatively close together and they had a similar pattern to them. But some potential errors in this experiment could be like any rounding that was done throughout the process, and then not accounting for motion in the z-axis, since some motion could have happened that way, but we only looked at it in the x and the y direction, and other forces like air resistance or any rotation that the object had were not accounted for, so that's why the simulation could be different from the observed experiment. Now for the further questions, there was 2 what does it mean questions. The first one was, is the energy principle satisfied? And it's yes, because the total energy was constant, because the delta E stayed at 0 the whole time, so that means there was no change in energy. So energy was conserved since no external forces were doing any external work, since the energy stayed the same. And then for the second one, it was the estimating the oscillation periods in the x and the y direction. So On the X, the oscillation period was 1.66 and the Y it was 1.52. Note that these two numbers are different, which means that you cannot calculate the period using solely the X direction movement in the X direction or solely the movement in the Y direction. You need to be able to look at everything together to calculate a true period, and that's a misconception that you must make sure that you're accounting for whenever you're doing something like this, so you don't accidentally get the wrong period because you only looked at one direction. And that's it. Thank you.